Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive with a slammed door or a broken vow. Sometimes it enters like a draft under the door, barely there until you're freezing. There was a time when I believed love was a matter of character, that if you were loyal, honest, and smart enough to choose well, the rest would follow. I don't say this with naivety, but with the quiet arrogance of someone who had studied people her whole life and assumed she'd learned the patterns well enough to avoid the traps. My name is Elena Grant. I am or was a corporate forensic accountant, the sort of person who knows how to follow the trail no one wants found. I spent years deciphering patterns of deception in boardrooms, unraveling embezzlement schemes with the cold precision of a surgeon. I thought that skill set, that training extended to my personal life, that I'd know. But betrayal, when it's close to home, doesn't move like fraud. It doesn't have tells or signatures. It speaks in micro-expressions, in paused sentences. In the shift of a wrist when reaching for a phone, and for a long time I didn't want to see it, not from Adrian, not from the man I married. We met in a way that felt accidental but was. His family's firm had hired mine for a merger audit. He was the legal liaison, charming, meticulous, with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never really lost anything. He carried his privilege with elegance, as if unaware it was armor. I was not unaware, but I was intrigued. His mother, Meredith, didn't hide her distaste, not for the relationship, not for me. The first time she met me, she asked if I'd had the benefit of boarding school, as if social graces were hereditary. The second time she asked if my parents were in trade. I should have walked away then. But I didn't, because Adrian looked at me like I was something rare, because I'd spent my life being overlooked and thought perhaps I'd finally been seen. We married in a small ceremony at his family's estate. The sun was too bright that day. I remember squinting in photographs, a strange metaphor I only later appreciated. From the beginning, I felt the weight of performance, like I'd stepped into a role I hadn't auditioned for, but I was good at adapting. I learned their codes, I wore the right things, said the right words. I laughed at Meredith's jokes even when they sliced. I played the dutiful wife with the detached competence they mistook for passivity, but even the best actors have a threshold. The first real sign was so small I nearly missed it. Adrian's phone, a second one I hadn't known he owned, buzzing on the nightstand while he was in the shower. I didn't check it. I told myself I respected his privacy, but the thought grew like a splinter. Then came the late nights, the business trips that extended by a day or two. The sex, less frequent, became mechanical. He said it was work stress. I believed him, or pretended to. I wasn't ready to admit I misjudged the man I'd tethered my life to. Then one morning in October, something shifted. I had returned home early from a trip to unexpected cancellation. I didn't tell Adrian. I wanted to surprise him. Instead, I surprised myself. He wasn't home. He hadn't been for hours. His office said he was out with a client. But the tracker on his car, installed during a brief wave of paranoia during a corporate job, showed him at an address I didn't recognize. A townhouse in Logan Circle. I sat in the car across the street and waited. He exited nearly 2 hours later, hair damp, tie loosened, smiling in that careless way he rarely smiled at me anymore. He kissed her before he got in his car. A woman I didn't recognize, younger, softer, with the vague anonymity of someone curated for discretion. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even feel, not at first, just silence. Not the kind between words, but the kind after a door slams shut in your mind. I drove home, I made dinner, I asked him about his day. He lied, I nodded. That night I lay beside him, our backs not quite touching, and stared at the ceiling for hours. The next day I began to trace, not just his steps, but his accounts. I accessed the shared statements, then the private ones. I followed the digital fingerprints, and what I found made the infidelity look like a side note. There were transfers, small, calculated, funds routed through shell accounts, siphoned from a trust I hadn't known I was entitled to, investments made in my name without my consent, contracts altered, signatures forged. Adrian hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He'd been erasing me financially, piece by piece. I didn't confront him, not yet. I documented everything, quietly, precisely. Like I would with any client, but this time the fraudster was my husband, and I wasn't just the accountant, I was the reckoning. There's a cruelty in the ordinary, a kind of violence in how it persists long after the truth has begun to rot beneath it. We sat at the same dinner table, passed the same salt, smiled, but something vital had gone soundless. For 3 weeks I told myself I was imagining it, gaslighted myself, frankly, more efficiently than anyone else ever could. That's the thing about highly competent women, we are experts at rationalizing, at deferring doubt, because the world tells us to be gracious, to be understanding, not to jump to conclusions. Still, I noticed. It was in the way Andrew came home just 10 minutes later than usual, not late enough to warrant suspicion, just late enough to feel off, the kind of shift you wouldn't mention out loud for fear of sounding petty, insecure, controlling. And God, if there's one thing the Aldridges were allergic to, it was a woman who didn't know her place. But it wasn't just the lateness. He'd begun charging things to our joint account that he would normally put on his own card. Dinners I hadn't attended, wine I hadn't tasted, flowers I hadn't received, a hotel in Montauk that neither of us had stayed in. When I asked about it, his face rearranged itself smoothly, almost beautifully, into that look men have perfected over centuries. You're overthinking it, Elle. It's not what it looks like. Work took longer than expected. You're tired, you've been under stress. The condescension wasn't overt, Andrew was too practiced for that. It came in as an undercurrent, like a song you didn't realize was playing until it seeped under your skin. And here's the thing, I didn't explode, I didn't accuse, I didn't cry, I watched, I collected. I traced the hairline fractures across the porcelain of our life, waiting to see which one would finally split wide. The day I knew, really knew, came quiet and uneventful like most turning points do. I'd come home from the office early. My client had canceled and I felt no desire to linger at the firm. Something in me wanted to be home, though I hadn't yet admitted to myself why. The house was still. Andrew wasn't due for another hour, but his car was already in the drive. At first I thought maybe he's sick, maybe he's resting. A sliver of guilt touched my ribs, how easily I'd begun to expect betrayal, how quickly my faith had withered under the weight of small, consistent disappointments. But then I heard it, laughter, not from him, from her, high, polished, a little performative, a sound that didn't belong here. I didn't storm up the stairs, I didn't even pause. I turned back toward the garage, stepped into the side hallway, and entered my office from the back, where I'd installed a small camera 6 months ago after a minor break-in. I rarely checked the footage, but it had been running quietly all along. I rewound, slow and methodical, and there she was, Madeline, not a stranger, not some faceless assistant, but someone known, family adjacent, the goddaughter of Andrew's mother, the ever-loathed Margaret Aldridge, with her wine-soaked disdain and country club coldness. It was deliberate, it was orchestrated. Madeline had let herself in with a key. She wore familiarity like a second skin, went to the bar cart, poured herself a drink, and waited for my husband like she owned the walls. When he entered, his hand brushing her waist with practiced ease, I stopped the video. There was no affair to uncover, not really. It had already metastasized into something worse, complicity, arrogance, comfort. And that's when something inside me, something buried beneath loyalty, beneath years of swallowing their poison with a smile, clicked. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I made a list. In the days that followed, I became a collector of small, damning truths. I traced the origin of the Montauk charge, a private villa booked under a holding company Margaret Aldridge owned. I pulled bank statements, tracking slow, quiet diversions of funds from our investment portfolio. Not theft, not quite. Just enough to qualify as mismanagement under the right lens. I reached out discreetly to an acquaintance who specialized in forensic accounting. Every piece I gathered painted a larger picture. I wasn't simply being cheated on, I was being sidelined financially, emotionally, strategically. They were preparing to cast me aside cleanly without scandal. No blowout, no mess, just replaced like a fixture that no longer matched the decor. I saw it then with a kind of brutal clarity. They had never intended to love me forever. I was acceptable until I was, useful until I was, and I had been very, very useful. The polished lawyer wife with the humble roots. The rags to riches narrative they could dangle at dinners to impress guests, to feel progressive, open-minded. I had made them look good until I didn't, until the shine wore off, until I became inconvenient. I was done crying over men who underestimated me. What they didn't realize, not Andrew, not his mother, not her carefully trained pet of a goddaughter, was that I had seen all of it. Long before it unfolded, the smug glances, the whispered dinners, the estate planning discussions that had slowly begun to exclude me. They thought I was just now waking up. They were wrong. I was already writing the final scene, but it wouldn't be a confrontation. Not a thrown drink, not a raised voice, not a scene in some public restaurant where I flung his sins across the table for everyone to see. No, it would be a reckoning, curated, controlled, and exquisitely timed. I wasn't planning to burn the house down, I was planning to renovate the narrative, and this time I'd be the one holding the pen. Vengeance, if it's to be done properly, must never feel like vengeance at all. It should resemble justice wearing pearls. That's what I told myself the morning I returned to the Aldridge estate, not as a wife, not even as a guest, but as an architect of endings, of exits, of a story they never imagined I'd be writing. The first rule of power, real power, is patience. I didn't storm the gates, I smiled. I accepted Meredith's invitation to her annual spring gala with a calm that unsettled even myself. It was the kind of event designed to launder reputations under chandeliers, where women whispered in diamonds and men drank scotch with clenched jaws and polished grievances. I'd declined the invitation every year since our wedding. This year I RSVP'd yes, because this year I needed an audience. By now I had everything: records, screenshots. Voice memos from hushed phone calls I intercepted from the guest house line, because Andrew, for all his strategic savvy, still used old habits in familiar places. I traced money through 3 trusts, 2 Delaware corporations, and one particularly sloppy attempt at an offshore transfer. I even had a notarized document with my forged signature on it, filed discreetly 6 months ago to shift the ownership of a jointly held property into his name alone. It wasn't just infidelity anymore. It was fraud, and the most satisfying part, they weren't even careful, because they never believed I would look. They believed I was grateful to be here, that I'd play my part, stay soft, stay silent. But silence, I've learned, is not the absence of power, it's where it lives until it's ready. On the night of the gala, I wore navy, understated, tailored, elegant enough to be remembered, neutral enough not to look like armor. My hair was pinned, my heels made no sound. When I entered, Meredith's expression tightened only slightly, a faint flicker in her left brow. She hadn't expected me to come. "Eleanor," she purred, brushing both cheeks with hers like we were European. "How lovely. I was just saying how we've missed you at these things." I smiled, let her hold my hand longer than necessary. "I've missed them too, so much to catch up on." Andrew arrived late. He always did. Power to him was in making others wait. He kissed my cheek, public, calculated, and made the mistake of whispering, "Thank you for behaving." I smiled. Always. What they didn't know was that every person in that room who mattered, the estate lawyer, the financial advisor, 2 board members from Andrew's firm, had already received a neatly bound packet from me marked confidential, hand-delivered 2 hours before the event. Inside, timelines, evidence, the full map of deceit drawn with surgical precision. There was no fury in it. No accusation, just numbers, dates, signatures, a quiet dismantling of a narrative they had spent years curating. I wasn't trying to ruin them, not directly. I simply removed myself, legally, financially, emotionally, in a way that made it impossible for them to do anything but implode. Meredith's reputation, so carefully built, would suffer under the weight of the laundering trail that ran through her foundation. Andrew's partnership prospects would evaporate once his conflict of interest disclosures came to light, but I didn't say any of this out loud. I didn't need to, I simply waited. It took an hour, that's all. One of the firm's senior partners, Stephen Wexler, tall, soft-voiced, once fond of telling me how unusual it was for a woman of my background to manage money so well, cornered Andrew near the bar. They didn't yell. But I watched Andrew's face shift from charm to confusion to quiet panic. By dessert, Meredith's smile had cracked. The news was moving. The tide was turning. I slipped out before the speeches began. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. We filed the divorce, seized back every asset, submitted a formal fraud report. I didn't need a courtroom scene. I didn't want one. What I wanted, what I got, was to leave without begging for dignity. They didn't see me go. They only felt the absence. There's something no one tells you about freedom. It's not loud. It doesn't arrive in a crescendo. It's quiet, soft. Mine came in the form of an apartment I leased under my own name, a desk by the window, a glass of wine that no one would drink but me, no one to lie to, no one to impress, just stillness. And in that stillness I remembered something I'd long buried. I was never theirs to erase. I had been the backbone of their empire, and I'd walked out with the spine intact. Freedom doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with fanfare or applause. It comes quietly when you stop asking for anything but truth. I didn't tell anyone right away, not my colleagues, not my sister who had always said I was too polished for that man, not even the doorman at the new building who greeted me every morning with Mrs. Aldridge. I let the name linger a little longer than I should have, not because I missed it, but because I wanted to understand what it had really meant. What I had traded for it, the answer came slowly. in coffee brewed the way I liked it, in walking barefoot across a floor I'd chosen, in sleeping diagonally in a bed that didn't smell like someone else's cologne. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was peace, and that felt revolutionary. Andrew tried to contact me, of course, not right away, he was too proud for that. But once the firm initiated its review, once Meredith's name began circulating in whispered conversations at galas she once ruled like royalty, once Madeline disappeared to Europe without so much as a goodbye, then came the calls. At first they were sterile. Let's be civil, Elle, we don't have to destroy each other. I was under pressure. You know how complicated things got. Then desperation dressed as indignation. You made this public, you're ruining reputations. You're smarter than this, aren't you? But I didn't respond, not because I didn't have things to say, but because I'd already said everything I needed to, with documents, with silence, with leaving. He didn't deserve the intimacy of my voice anymore. People always expect fury from women like me, the composed ones, the ones who wait, who hold their tongues, who play the long game. They think when we finally break, we'll scream. But I didn't break. I evolved. I kept going to work. Quietly accepted a consulting offer in Chicago. Sublet my old office space to a friend, set up a small firm, nothing flashy, just me, a paralegal I trusted, and a client list built from those who'd watched me survive the Aldridges and wanted that same precision. I wasn't rebuilding, I was refining. I no longer wanted the illusion of belonging to anyone else's world. I wanted a life that fit me without tailoring. Meredith sent a letter, handwritten, tidy cursive. The kind that looks graceful until you read it closely and see the blade inside the bow. She called my actions unseemly, said I'd embarrassed Andrew, that I should have come to her as if she were the final court of appeal for all things decent. She warned that I'd made powerful enemies. I framed the letter, hung it beside my desk, not as a trophy, as a reminder that I had once been someone she thought she could silence. Now I was someone she had to write to. The Aldridge name began to shift in public. It was slow, subtle, a board appointment rescinded, a charity gala indefinitely postponed. Their legacy was not collapsing, it was corroding from the inside, and I had done nothing but tell the truth. Andrew's firm offered a quiet settlement, generous if you don't know what you're worth, insulting if you do. I declined. Instead, I pushed forward with a civil suit, not for vengeance, but for restoration. My lawyer called it elegant warfare. I called it overdue. One night, alone on my balcony, I watched the city hum beneath me. I poured a glass of wine. The same label I once brought to a dinner at the Aldridge estate, only for Meredith to tell me it was charming for a table wine. I laughed softly, not bitter, just clear. They had tried to reduce me, frame me, fold me into a narrative that kept me convenient, quiet, and contained. But the truth is, I had never been any of those things. I'd only been patient. And patience in the right hands is lethal. What people never understand about controlled burns is that they're not about destruction, they're about survival. You set fire to what's dying so something else has space to live. By spring the air had changed. I don't mean the weather, though that too had softened, as if the world was finally loosening its grip. I mean the way people looked at me, once with pity, now with caution, not fear, just respect. The kind that settles into a room before you speak. The kind earned only when you've proven you can take a punch and still keep your posture straight. My inbox filled with referrals I hadn't asked for. Quiet messages from women, 2 of them lawyers, one a judge, thanking me for how I handled it. You didn't scream. You didn't flinch. You didn't fold. They were wrong, of course. I had flinched. I had screamed, just not where anyone could see. I'd done it in the still hours in that first apartment where I learned to live again without checking for someone else's reflection in the mirror. But yes, publicly I had not folded. The lawsuit didn't drag on. Andrew, for all his charm and entitlement, wasn't stupid. Once discovery began, once my legal team submitted the preliminary findings and he saw how thoroughly I had documented every omission, every dollar, every signature, he moved to settle. But it was too late for a quiet exit. The board opened an internal investigation. The firm issued a vague statement about restructuring. He was placed on indefinite leave, and Meredith, she disappeared from the front page. No more glossy interviews, no more charity brunches. Her foundation issued an apology for clerical oversights and withdrew from 2 major partnerships. None of this was my revenge, it was just the consequence. The natural result of believing no one was watching and then realizing you misjudged the quietest person in the room. Madeline never resurfaced, not to apologize, not to explain. She vanished like mist from a mirror, and I didn't go looking. She had never been the story. She was a symptom, not a cause, and women like her, they don't last, not really, not where truth is required. The day the settlement closed, I stood in my office and opened the envelope myself. It wasn't the number that mattered, though it was substantial. It was the language, in recognition of all contributions, material and otherwise. My attorney said it was the most passive-aggressive concession she'd seen in years. I thought it was perfect, because yes, I had contributed to his reputation, to their image, to the legacy they were now fighting to preserve. But more than that, I had rewritten my own, and this time no one else held the pen. I didn't tell anyone about the final clause I insisted on, that the Aldridges never contact me again. Not directly, not through proxies, not in public or private spaces. It was technically a formality, a symbolic line, but I needed that line because some endings don't arrive with heartbreak. They arrive with clarity, and clarity is addictive. That summer I bought a lake house, not because I needed the space or the solitude, but because I wanted something untouched by them. No Aldridge linens. No inheritance-dyed real estate, just walls I chose, air I paid for, and silence that belonged to no one else. Some nights I'd sit on the dock and let the breeze tell me all the things I'd forgotten I could feel: ease, lightness, the absence of performance. And sometimes I'd think of the girl I used to be, trying to earn her place at their table. She was gone, but in her place stood a woman who had learned how to build her own. You'd think the story ends there, neatly, with me above water, finally breathing. But life isn't a novel. It doesn't tie bows, it leaves threads. And one of those threads, tattered but still attached, was this question: who do I become now that I'm no longer surviving them? That's the part no one prepares you for, not the exit, the afterward. After the smoke clears, you don't hear applause, you hear your own breath. The real question is, can you live with the silence you fought to earn? At first, I mistook the quiet for loneliness. I'd been so used to noise, the rustle of evening suits, the cold precision of Meredith's passive barbs, the sterile arguments behind mahogany doors that passed for marriage. Even our silences, Andrew's and mine, had a shape, a tension held like breath just beneath the surface. Now there was only the hum of my refrigerator and the low, intermittent creak of wood settling in the beams of the lake house. No interruptions, no audience, no performance. The first few days I found myself speaking aloud just to fill the air. "Coffee, on," I said once out of habit, before remembering no one else would answer. And still, I never once wished to go back. I didn't date. That's always the question people ask in that gently intrusive tone. Have you thought about seeing someone again? As if healing were synonymous with replacement. As if men were furniture you upgraded and not, in some cases, the fire that raised the entire house. I wasn't angry. Not anymore, but I also wasn't interested. What I wanted was reclamation, not of my time, not even of my name, but of the space in me that had gone dormant. The part that had stopped reading novels, the part that used to cook for joy, not presentation, the part that didn't flinch at kindness or strategize around affection. I wanted to remember who I was before they told me who to be. Work came in steadily. The consultancy grew, almost in spite of me. Referrals from former colleagues, sometimes even people who had once looked down on me. They reached out discreetly, of course. Reputation still matters in those circles, even when they're crumbling. Some were survivors of their own betrayals, high-functioning, intelligent women with glazed smiles and NDA-bound pasts. They didn't want drama, they wanted direction, and I gave it to them, not just numbers, but tools. I showed them how to read a ledger like a lie. How to trace the story a man tries to hide in tax language and shared trusts. I watched them transform, not all at once, but incrementally, spine by spine. One client sent me a single line after her divorce finalized: "You gave me a way out that looked like a way in." I cried when I read it, not because I felt powerful, but because I finally felt seen. One afternoon, nearly a year after the gala, I got an invitation. It wasn't addressed in handwriting I recognized, but the event was unmistakable: a fundraiser hosted by the Aldridge Foundation. Rebranding, they were calling it now, a new mission, a fresh start, a way, I imagine, for Meredith to prove she could still stage a resurrection. I smiled, set the card down, poured myself a glass of water, didn't RSVP. Freedom is not needing to be present to prove your absence. I did see Andrew once, briefly, on a sidewalk in the city. He was with someone. A woman, stylish, forgettable. He glanced up, startled, started to say something. I didn't stop. I didn't look away either. I just kept walking, heels silent on the pavement, like the sound of something ending so long ago it no longer echoes. Healing is not a ceremony, it's not a retreat or a declaration. It's in the smallest choices, repeated until they feel like muscle memory. Choosing peace over closure, solitude over spectacle, self-respect over apology. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing to explain why I left. The story had already spoken for itself. I still have the framed letter from Meredith. I keep it in a drawer now, not as proof, as a souvenir of a life I endured, and of the quiet, powerful woman who stepped out from its ashes, not angry, not broken, just done, and finally entirely free. Being right doesn't always feel like a victory. Sometimes it feels like standing alone in a room full of people who finally believe you and realizing you no longer care. They started rewriting the story, slowly, strategically. In interviews, Meredith described the past year as challenging. Andrew appeared on a panel about corporate accountability, flanked by men who smiled like politicians and spoke in reformist soundbites. There was talk of moving forward, of lessons learned. No one said my name, they couldn't. That was part of the settlement, no references, direct or indirect, no framing, no version of the truth that cast me as unstable, emotional, difficult. They had to pretend I never existed, at least publicly, but erasure has a cost, and I had made peace with my silence. I wasn't interested in correcting the narrative anymore, let them talk to themselves. Privately, it was harder to ignore. A former colleague from the firm emailed me, "You were right, we all saw it. We just didn't say anything." Another wrote, "We should have backed you when it mattered. I'm sorry, they meant well, I know they did, but the thing about vindication is it doesn't unmake the betrayal, it just names it, and by the time you hear the apologies, the wound is already scarred." I didn't respond to most of them, not out of bitterness, but because I no longer felt like explaining the cost of surviving something no one else was willing to stop. One message stayed with me. From Celia Greaves, an old acquaintance from my early audit days. I hadn't spoken to her in years. She wrote, "You always played the long game. I didn't think you had it in you to follow through, but you did. Quiet, precise, lethal. Was it worth it?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Was it? The house was mine, my firm was thriving, my reputation among people who mattered was untarnished. I had no skeletons, I had made sure of that, but the life I thought I'd have, the person I thought I'd be beside. Gone. Sometimes I missed the idea of it, not him, not them, but the fantasy, the version of me that could have belonged. I closed the email without replying, because if you have to ask whether it was worth it, you'll never understand the answer. One night, a storm swept in fast. The lake blurred with rain. I stood at the window with a glass of red wine and remembered the last time Andrew and I weathered a storm together. It had been our 3rd year of marriage. The lights had gone out. He lit candles. We laughed. We made pasta in the dark and eaten it on the floor like college students. I don't remember what we talked about that night, but I remember how his voice sounded when he said, "I don't think I've ever felt this peaceful." And I'd believed him. That memory used to ache. Now it just felt like a story someone else told me. Freedom is an expensive thing. It costs comfort, familiarity, the security of pretending everything is fine. It costs the version of yourself who stays silent to survive. But what you get in return, if you're patient, if you're precise, is a life that fits, one you don't have to defend, one you don't have to explain, one that doesn't shrink to make others comfortable. I paid the price, and I'd do it again. I've stopped trying to be understood by people who would rather see me pleasing than powerful. They don't need to know the truth, I do, and I carry it like a compass, not a weapon. Because this isn't about vengeance anymore. It's about walking away so far for so long that you forget what it felt like to ever look back. There's a version of me they still remember, the agreeable one, the woman who smiled through insults, smoothed over lies, played her part. What they don't realize is she's gone. I buried her quietly, and I didn't send flowers. It's always the quiet ones. That's what they used to say behind my back. I know because Meredith once said it to my face just softly enough that I was meant to wonder if I'd misheard. "She's so self-contained," she murmured, passing me a glass of wine at some fundraiser, her hand hovering too long on the stem. "So calm, it's admirable really, but sometimes I wonder, what's underneath all that composure?" I smiled, took the wine, said nothing. But now I can answer her, what was underneath wasn't emptiness, it was restraint. And eventually, restraint becomes clarity, and clarity, well, that's when people start to get nervous. I think often about the woman I used to be, the version of myself I spent years training into stillness. She was competent, predictable, dignified to a fault, the kind of woman who overprepared for meetings, sent thank you notes after being insulted at dinner and said it's fine when it was. She was useful to them, but she wasn't me. She was a survival mechanism. A shape I learned to take, and unlearning her, that's been harder than leaving Andrew, because she's the one who let it happen, she's the one who stayed. It's strange how long it takes to trust yourself again. Even now, I'll catch myself triple-checking the tone of an email, making sure it doesn't sound too direct. I still hesitate before saying no, still flinch slightly when I take up space without apology. Healing isn't linear, it's layered, it's mundane, it's not in burning bridges. It's in building new ones and walking across them alone. But each time I do, I step further away from the woman who was trained to minimize her needs, further toward the woman who no longer asks permission. A few weeks ago, I was invited to speak at a panel on financial autonomy. The irony wasn't lost on me. A room full of people applauding my insights, not knowing I'd spent years being financially disassembled by a man who once told me I was too detail-oriented. I almost declined. But then I thought about the women who might be sitting in that audience. Women like I was, competent, quiet, unsure where the line between love and erasure had begun to blur. So I went, I spoke, and for the first time in years I didn't soften my voice, I didn't make it palatable, I told the truth. Afterward, one woman waited until the crowd thinned out, mid-30s, crisp blazer, smile too tight. She looked at me and said, "You didn't sound angry, you just sounded done." I nodded. She exhaled, "I think I'm almost there too." People talk about betrayal like it's a single moment, a text message, a phone call, a kiss, but betrayal, I've learned, is a slow erosion. It's in the dozen daily decisions someone makes not to protect you, the missed chances to choose you, and the ease with which they choose themselves instead. It accumulates, and eventually it overflows. I no longer hate Andrew, not because he deserves forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. Hatred binds you to the person who wronged you. Indifference frees you. He no longer lives in my mind, he's just a chapter, a caution, a name I used to say without flinching. And Meredith, she's just a woman clinging to a world that's finally slipping out from under her. Let her hold on, I've let go. You don't get to rewrite history, but you do get to decide who tells it from here. The first time I walked through the doors of my firm's new downtown office, I felt a quiet kind of satisfaction, not pride exactly, something sharper, more internal, like the feeling of walking back into a house you built after surviving the fire that nearly destroyed it. We kept it small by choice, clean lines, glass walls, every desk was intentional, no excess, no noise, just focus. People came to us when they needed precision, when the story beneath the numbers was too dangerous to ignore. When the lies were too polished for anyone else to see. Funny how betrayal trains you to spot it in others. I didn't want power, not in the traditional sense. What I wanted was agency, and now I had it. Every day, women walked through that door asking the same silent question I once whispered to myself at 2 in the morning, is it really that bad? And every day I helped them find the answer, gently, clearly, without judgment. Not all of them left their marriages, not all needed to. But every single one left with their eyes open. That's the part no one teaches you. You don't always need an exit, you just need clarity, and clarity is what I gave them. I got a letter from Andrew, typed, not handwritten, delivered via courier as if we were still performing the roles of people who mattered to one another. He said he was sorry, that he never meant to hurt me, that so much had changed. I stared at it for a long time, then folded it neatly and dropped it in the shredder. There's a difference between closure and invitation. That letter was the latter, and I was done with doors that only led back into rooms I'd already escaped. People think revenge is loud, but real vengeance, the kind that leaves a mark, doesn't announce itself. It just exists in the life you build without them. In the fact that their names no longer appear in your calendar, that you no longer flinch at their absence, that they have become irrelevant. The final rewrite isn't dramatic, it's practical. It's waking up in your own home, opening your own windows, making coffee without a performance. It's filing your taxes without finding someone else's debts under your name. It's loving your own company, trusting your own instincts. It's walking into a room without adjusting yourself to be more acceptable, more palatable, more theirs. Sometimes I still run into people from that life, at events, in courtrooms. Occasionally at restaurants where Meredith's name is still whispered like folklore, faded but never quite erased. They look at me differently now, some with curiosity, some with regret, some with that quiet, patronizing awe reserved for women who were supposed to disappear and didn't. I don't offer explanations, I just raise my glass politely, because they'll never know how much I gave to that life, but they'll never forget how gracefully I took it back. Some endings don't break you, they sculpt you. Cut away the parts that were never yours until all that remains is the woman who should have been allowed to exist all along. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic courtroom reckoning, no staged apology in front of a crowd, no tearful regret from Andrew, no last-ditch plea from Meredith. It just ended, quietly, almost clinically. The settlement closed, the audits completed. The last Aldridge staffer who'd once referred to me as the outsider resigned under vague circumstances. And I walked away, not with vengeance, with certainty. The lake house remained mine. I'd had offers on it, wealthy couples wanting a clean escape from the city. But I declined, not because I was attached to the walls or the view, but because it had become the physical embodiment of something I'd never had in their world: safety, not luxury, not status, just the absence of performance, the space to exhale. I hosted small dinners there now, friends, women I trusted. The kind of people who didn't measure worth by pedigree or proximity to power. We sat under string lights and passed plates and laughed without surveillance. And once one of them asked gently, "Do you ever miss it, any of it?" I didn't answer right away. I took a sip of wine, watched the sky settle into itself, then I said, "I miss who I thought I could be inside that life." She nodded, understanding immediately. That's the thing about intelligent women, we grieve illusions more deeply than we ever grieve people. I started writing, too, not a memoir, not a tell-all, something quieter. Essays mostly on ethics, on finance, on the soft violence of being underestimated. I didn't sign them with my married name, didn't need to. The words carried their own authority now. I'd found my voice again, and this time I wasn't lending it to anyone else's legacy. I saw Madeline once, a gallery opening. She was with someone older, richer, the same ghosted smile, the same shoes. A life lived in the slipstream of someone else's credit. She didn't recognize me at first, then she did, and she looked away. I didn't, not because I wanted her to see me, but because I no longer cared if she did. She'd been a chapter, nothing more, a necessary plot device. I had outlived the metaphor. In the end, I didn't destroy the Aldridges. They did that themselves. All I did was remove my silence. And when you take silence away from people who thrive on control, they unravel, not publicly, not always, but deeply. The kind of unraveling that leaves no fabric to mend. I walk differently now, not taller but steadier, not with defiance but with absence of apology. I used to walk into rooms wondering if I belonged. Now I ask if the room deserves me, and if it does, I leave. This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about waking up. About no longer bending yourself into a shape someone else decided was acceptable. It's about setting the table for yourself, even when no one else is coming. It's about choosing to stay, not because you're tolerated, but because you're home, and if that means walking alone, so be it. Some exits are lonely, but mine was never empty.